Welcome to United States History to 1877. Chapter 15, Reconstruction. In this lecture, you will learn the following information. 1. The struggle to answer questions of equality for freed blacks dominated the period of Reconstruction. 2. There were three Reconstruction plans: Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, and the plan by the Radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson was impeached by the Radical Republicans. 4. There were three Reconstruction amendments: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. 4. Southern whites took back control in something called redemption and set up racial laws for white supremacy. And lastly, 5. Reconstruction failed to preserve black equality. After the Civil War, much of the South lay in ruin. The work of starting again after fighting centered on two central problems. The answer to these problems lay in deciding what exactly citizenship and equality would be for the newly freed slaves. In the years after the Civil War, it was a moment of revolutionary possibility as well as violent backlash. Resistance continued, and Reconstruction eventually collapsed. In the South, limits on human freedom would continue for nearly a century after the Civil War was over. Reconstruction actually began even before the Civil War ended. The time period of the Reconstruction era is identified by historians as stretching from 1865 to 1877, but Abraham Lincoln began planning for Reconstruction even before, in 1863, sensing a Union victory was inevitable. Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was to allow for Confederate states to return to the Union if 10% of the state population would swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. This is known as Lincoln's 10% Plan. In addition to the oath of loyalty to the United States, the Southern Confederate states also had to accept the newly passed 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which had formally ended the institution of slavery. But the 13th Amendment did allow for slavery to continue if someone had been convicted of a crime. When the assassin John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865, Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was replaced by his vice president and new successor, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a states' rights, unapologetic racist from Tennessee and offered the Confederate States quick restoration into the Union. He pardoned all Southerners who fought in the war except for wealthy plantation owners. In the South, Mississippi and South Carolina immediately passed laws known as the Black Codes. The purpose was to regulate black behavior and impose social and economic control. While protecting some rights, these laws also denied other fundamental ones, such as serving on a jury, testifying in court, and severely punished homelessness. The purpose of the anti-vagrancy laws throughout the South was meant to restrict the travel of blacks, keeping them as a captive labor force. The violation of these black codes could see African Americans imprisoned and then leased out as labor, much like a slave. Republicans in Congress were outraged when President Andrew Johnson declared that the South had been restored. In response, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to prohibit any violation of fundamental rights. The Radical Republicans, as they were known at the time, put forward the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, giving equal protection under the laws to all Americans, specifically stating that any background in slavery or of a different race would not be allowable for discrimination. President Johnson did not agree that African Americans deserved equal rights. He campaigned against it and vetoed the proposal, only to have his veto overturned by the Radical Republicans in Congress. Because of Andrew Johnson's repeated blocks on Reconstruction policies, the Radical Republicans in Congress impeached him in the House of Representatives. Johnson narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate by only one vote. The Radical Republicans enjoyed great success in addressing the problems left over from slavery through amendments to the Constitution itself. They passed the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed due process and equality under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which granted African Americans the right to vote. In the election of 1868, former Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency, campaigning on a platform and a slogan of "Let us have peace." Grant's victory came from strong support from African Americans who voted for the very first time. Indeed, it was a historic victory because it represented the full promise of what the United States meant when it said all men are created equal in its founding documents. While not completely true, it was an important step forward toward the dream of equality for all Americans. Indeed, because of Grant's victory and the participation of African American voters, African Americans served at every level of government during Reconstruction. But when Reconstruction ended, white Democrats throughout the South regained political control, and all but a few African American office holders were forced out of office. The question of land for the former slaves was an important one that met with great debate and hot resistance. When he issued his Special Field Order No. 15, William Tecumseh Sherman determined that land would be set aside for the freedmen, 40 acres and a mule for every single former slave. It is important to note that early on, the absence of any property for the freedmen was a problem that had been identified, limiting their ability to be equal in a society based upon property rights. One of the core missions of the Freedmen's Bureau had been to redistribute land to the freedmen, but in 1866, the land was returned to Confederates instead. Agents working for the Freedmen's Bureau even told the former slaves that promises of land would not be honored, and that they should go back to work for their former masters, but as wage labor this time. These agents, in order that crops would be harvested, sometimes forced the freedmen to sign contracts to work for their former masters. Radical Republicans failed to come up with the land in the Congress and favored instead economic stability rather than social justice when it came to the question of how to treat the former slaves. Black churches, which had been established by the Freedmen's Bureau, gained regional, state, and even national associations. They provided leadership and organization during Reconstruction. Black churches also provided space for debates over gender roles, cultural values, practices, norms, and political engagement, and conducted many weddings as well. Reconstruction involved more than just the meaning of emancipation for former slaves, however. Women activists, fresh from the abolitionist fight, sought to raise women's rights as the next crusade. After the war, the Supreme Court had recognized that women had citizenship, but stopped short of granting voting rights. Reconstruction attempted to create a biracial society in the South, but that dream was shattered after the war. Accustomed to violence as a part of enforcing slavery, white Southerners could not imagine a black free labor force. As before, violence would be used by whites after the war to return to the old ways of white supremacy. The social order of the South had always rested on an enslaved class of people with an economy that required unfree labor. After the war, with the foundation of Southern society shaken, Southern whites used black codes and racial terrorism to reassert control of former slaves. They often justified their actions by claiming that the government was helping freed blacks unfairly. While African Americans had gained citizenship and could sit on juries, white Southerners were almost never prosecuted for violence against black victims. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan murdered or terrorized African Americans if they became economically independent or tried to even purchase land. The Klan was just one of many white terror groups across the South. Because of the widespread terrorism, the federal government passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870, making it a crime to deprive African Americans of their rights, while allowing the Army to enforce the law. By 1876, Southern Democrats reestablished Home Rule, claiming to have redeemed the South. Because the national attention had moved on, African Americans remained trapped in a world of white supremacy that restricted their economic, social, and political rights. The Civil War destroyed and then transformed the American economy. On the eve of the war, the American South enjoyed an economy stronger than most in the world. To their masters, the slaves represented the most valuable asset, worth roughly $3 billion. The Civil War interrupted commercial life by destroying lives and property. Emancipation was the most significant economic, social, and political outcome of the war. Former slaves were then reduced to sharecroppers, a form of slavery made possible through the Jim Crow laws of the South, where debt and violence kept black farmers working for their former masters. Reconstruction ended when Northerners abandoned the cause of the former slaves and Democrats recaptured Southern politics. The Panic of 1873 resulted in a national depression that devastated the economy. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidential election without ever mentioning the word Reconstruction. The nation was now concerned with other priorities. Reconstruction had achieved Abraham Lincoln's primary goal of restoring the Union. The war had forever ended slavery, but it had left African Americans as second-class citizens, while women still struggled for full participation in public life. From the ashes of the Civil War, a new nation faced fresh possibilities while still holding on to old problems. In this lecture, we learned how The struggle to answer questions of equality for freed blacks dominated the period of Reconstruction. Also, that there were three Reconstruction plans: Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, and the plan for the Radical Republicans. We also learned how Andrew Johnson was impeached by the Radical Republicans. We learned that there were three Reconstruction amendments: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, and that Southern whites took back control, setting up racial laws for white supremacy. And finally, we learned that Reconstruction failed to preserve black equality, leaving them as second-class citizens trapped in a system of economic slavery. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 15, Reconstruction, created with work from the American Yawp, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University, edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with comments and narration by myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo. For more materials on U.S. history and for other readings, please go to historydojo.blog. And for other courses, please go to studydojo.org.